There are certain things in life that some people are afraid to confront and do their best to avoid it. Usually they don't go to drastic measures to do this, but some people go so far as to fake their own death. Now, this happened quite a few times in history and makes for an interesting story, but it's even more interesting when people of note attempt to do it for various reasons. So that's what we're going to be having a look at today. So here are 7 notable people who faked their own deaths. Number 1 is Timothy Dexter. Timothy Dexter was an American businessman and a popular writer. However, he wasn't a popular writer in a conventional sense. He was more so known because of his insanely strange writing methods. At the age of 50, he released a book about himself that contained over 8,000 words, and yet it didn't have a single piece of punctuation. Because of this, it's not that surprising that he was considered to be a bit of an eccentric. Well, this was solidified when he did something that was incredibly strange. He began to feel as if his peers didn't respect him enough, so Timothy faked his own death so that he could see how people would react. He hired a person to craft him a comfortable coffin, and then actually got some trustworthy friends of his to arrange his own funeral. Well, 3,000 people turned up to his wake, but he did not see his wife cry on the day, so he punished her relentlessly. The whole ordeal was extremely time-consuming and expensive, but Timothy was described as having somewhat of a god complex, so it wasn't actually that surprising. Number 2 is Chandra Mohan Sharma. Chandra Mohan Sharma was an Indian social activist who fought against his country's government and the National Land Mafia. While this seems like a noble cause, he was unhappy with his marriage and was seeing another woman. He decided he wanted to get out of that marriage and start a new life with the woman he was seeing. So he decided to fake his own death. However, the way he did it was very messy. Sharma befriended a mentally unstable homeless man who he later strangled to death and placed in his car. He then burned the car so that the body was unrecognizable, and immediately after he traveled to a different part of the country where he shaved his head and got a job. Around a month or so later, the woman he was seeing came to live with him, and this is when her family filed a missing persons report. Although Sharma was presumed dead and the police had no knowledge of the two having any kind of a relationship, they found out that the SIM card of her phone was in Sharma's name, and soon after this, they found Sharma. He admitted to killing the homeless man and was charged for murder. Number 3 is Alan Abel. Alan Abel was an American prankster and mockumentary filmmaker who pulled off a series of hoaxes in the 60s and 70s. He had quite a few successful mockumentaries and pulled off some well-known pranks, but one of his most famous hoaxes happened in 1979 when he faked his own death. He hired an actor to play a funeral director who came to where he was and collected his belongings. He also hired another actor to pretend to be his widow. She contacted the New York Times and they actually posted an obituary for his death on the 2nd of January 1980. Soon after this, a lot of news outlets began to report a similar story, utilizing the New York Times as their source, and a day later, Alan Abel held a news conference to confirm that he was indeed alive. The most famous quote from that conference being, "Reports of my demise have been grossly exaggerated." Number 4 is Ken Kesey. Ken Kesey is more than likely the most famous entry on this list, and that's because he was the author of the successful and controversial book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Well, in 1965, he was arrested for the possession of marijuana, and in order to get out of it, he faked his own death. He was a member of a group known as the Merry Pranksters who wrote a suicide note and left his truck on a cliffside road. The police assumed he had died, and Kesey fled to Mexico. He returned to the States 8 months later, and he was found by the police. He was sentenced to 5 months in a county jail. Number 5 is John Stonehouse. John Stonehouse was a controversial British politician who sold government plans to other countries. In November of 1974, he faked his own death while he was in Miami. The police found his clothes by a beach and assumed that he had either drowned or been attacked and killed by a shark. Although his body was never found, obituaries were posted and Stonehouse was assumed dead, when in reality he was on his way to Australia. It was there that he was found. He was brought back to Britain and sent to 7 years in jail. Number 6 is Alexander Baker. Alexander Ace Baker was a person who believed that the 9/11 attacks was an event organized by the American government. He was very public about his beliefs and often went on to media outlets to explain them. So much so that he set up his own radio show with some fellow theorists. However, Baker felt as if he wasn't respected in his circle. It may have been because of this that in one of these broadcasts he faked his own death. He started speaking in a solemn tone and apologized to his friends and family, and shortly after this he left the phone line and gunshots could be heard. Many listeners assumed that he had just committed suicide, when in reality it was all staged. He later stated that it was some kind of performance art, but many people believed he did it so that he'd be taken more seriously, or that he did it as some kind of a publicity stunt. Either way, the reasoning behind his choice is unclear. Number 7 is Aimee Semple McPherson. Aimee Semple McPherson was a religious preacher and media celebrity. She was the most known Christian preacher of her time, and remains that way today. She would preach in front of thousands of people, and her life was very well documented. So it came as quite a shock when, in the summer of 1926, she completely disappeared while going for a swim. Her mother stated that she was now with Jesus, and she was presumed to be dead. However, a month later, she was found in a Mexican town. She claimed to have been kidnapped, and this may have been the case, but her story was riddled with holes and contradictions. Other theories started to emerge, such as the idea that Aimee was romantically involved with a married man and decided to fake her own death to pursue it. This is because soon after she disappeared, that married man was spotted driving with someone who looked like Aimee. This entry is quite compelling. Evidence exists on both sides, but it's still unclear. Quite a few people do believe that the entire event was orchestrated. However, it does remain a mystery. And that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, don't forget to hit that like button. I'll leave a link down below to a similar list that I have made. My social medias are also down there if you want to keep up to date with anything that I'm doing. But, like I said, that's all for now. As always, until next time. Haha!